Hello, and welcome to today's show. We are continuing our season focused on AI. Today, my guest is Patrick Vizzone, a global agri-food investor, banker, and now a key player in driving AI and data innovation across the produce industry. He's worked across Asia, North America, and beyond. And today, he's deep in the weeds, building AI powered tools across operations. We'll talk about where AI is actually working now, what's hype, and why produce companies need to get serious about data or risk getting left behind. Welcome, Patrick. It's really great to have you here.
Thanks. Pleasure's all mine.
Yeah. So let's jump right in here. And why don't you can introduce yourself a little bit and then let's set the stage around this. How is AI showing up across the supply chain right now?
Yeah, so I guess by way of introduction to what do? I do a number of things. So when I'm not volunteering at the IFPA, which takes up a reasonable amount of time, I have the pleasure and privilege of being the chair-elect at the moment, and I'm really looking forward to the years ahead. But I spend nearly the entirety of my time at Vertical Oceans, which is an AI native um, aquaculture company. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I started life in fresh produce. I 30 years ago helped found a vertically integrated fresh cut company in China, of all places. Then, to your point, moved into food and agri banking, where I spent a couple of decades. And during that time, I spent more than a decade on the board of one of the largest agri-food companies. It was the Hong Kong listed subsidiary of this company. And it was at that time that I had this realization about 15 years ago that tech was going to fundamentally change agri-food supply chains in the fresh produce industry. So I started investing in agri-food tech through my investment firm. It's now called Agro Novare. I founded a few companies. One is Freshalytics. Our mission there, which is very appropriate for today's discussion, is to make what I would say sophisticated data intelligence tools available to all players across the supply chain. So to democratize the tools that were once really the domain of the largest players, and to also, in so doing, really try and make obsolete static research reports and move towards bringing real-time insights in a very accessible way to those that need it. But back to the point I made earlier around vertical oceans. So we are what I would call an AI native software company wrapped around a biological production system. It's quite a mouthful, but really our belief is to make an evolutionary change in particularly in terms of a production system. That system needs to be completely interconnected, firstly, and it needs to be as automated as possible. That's really the only way that you can truly optimize a system and to optimize a complex biological system. Now, we do this with prawns in aquaculture, but the technology can be used to approach any type of organism, whether aquatic or plant based. At the end of the day, yep. So that's what I do.
And many other hats, I'm sure. But
Few other
so
hats. Yeah.
how do you think AI is showing up across the supply chain now in different places? And what are you seeing and kind of with Vertical Oceans and Freshalytics, how are you dipping in?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I think I'll maybe try and answer that with respect to fresh produce, I guess.
Mhm.
So I think the first thing I'd say is the uptake is quite fragmented. So adoption is quite uneven, and we can get into the reasons why that is. You have certain parties in the supply chain, particularly more towards the consumer end, they're investing heavily and experimenting heavily. Other segments of the supply chain haven't even started really. There are a number of what I would call key entry points, if you like, where adoption is being centered. So one is production, and that's got a lot to do with yield forecasting, planning, around automation of trying to automate issues to do with crops, all of that type of stuff, I guess. The second I would say is in the middle around automation. That's really centered on documentation handling, if you like, a little bit around cold chain routing, for example. And then the third element I would say is communications, and that's really around chatbots, whether internally, externally, or otherwise. But the uptake has been very fragmented, I would say, and we're still very much at the beginning of this journey.
So, what do you think the roadblocks are? Why is it fragmented? Why is it slow? And what does that look like?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I would say it's sometimes easier to. So when we take AI as a catch-all phrase, it's sometimes easier to try and explain what AI can't do rather than the use cases, because the use cases are increasingly shaped by the number of tools that are available, compute, of course, but also in terms of innovation and creative thinking. And so it's sort of only limited by the imagination, so to speak. But there are a number of constraints. Now, one of them that we hear frequently about is the availability of data. Fine. The other is how clean that data is, and that is an issue as well. You also have things like systems integration and whatnot. But I actually see one of the most pronounced issues, shall we say, at the moment is organizational behavior and organizational incentives as being one of the biggest barriers, and particularly in fresh produce.
So, talk more about that. What are organizations doing that's causing a roadblock, and give some examples of what organizations are doing to break those roadblocks.
There are a number of buckets there. So, firstly, I'd say the data plumbing is messy. Okay, and so you've got data that resides in different places, hasn't been correctly tagged, hasn't been cleansed, which is not just an issue for fresh produce, but it's a perennial issue. That is a big impediment. Just to give you a very simple example, if you know where all your data is and it's appropriately categorized, you could start with publicly available data, for example, and you can go at that because you really can't break anything with publicly available data, particularly when it relates to data privacy or otherwise. So that is a very small but pertinent example. The organizational behavior piece is an interesting one. I think the adoption of tools and the adoption of AI more broadly often fails, not because the tech isn't good or the intention isn't there, but because teams don't want to share data. They see data as power. So there's that internal power dynamic. I guess it's my spreadsheet, it's my control, and that really does inhibit collaboration at the end of the day. There's also, I would put within that data hoarding as well on a team basis, an individual basis. And so, therefore, there's this resistance to change. And so, what that means is that you really need to have an edict or tone from the top of the organization to be able to drive that change across the organization, which then leads to the next point, which is, within an organization, who is best placed to drive either a distinct project or a fundamental rework of an organization. And I think if you want to see an evolutionary change, we're talking, orders of magnitude in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, then I'd go back to the point I made earlier around the importance of interconnectivity and automation. And that's not tinkering or experimenting, that's a fundamental redesign. But it's those fundamental organizational issues that go beyond the technology that can be the biggest inhibitor at times.
I know it's been difficult, and Kathy Burns has done an amazing job at IFPA. I think we're ahead with your help of really being a CEO who has said, we are using these tools, and these tools are going to differentiate us, and we're going to bring value to our members, and we're using these tools. And try to learn all this and everything. But I think, is that where it needs to start, is with a CEO, and then who kind of owns the project? I mean, I think a lot of times, because it has ones and zeros, they think the IT department should own it. So how does, if you were, if some, consultant X, or some company X called you to consult them, how would you tell them to kind of start integrating AI into their organization?
Yeah, good question. I'd approach it, generally speaking, in the same way that you would approach any project, or albeit one that's going to have a fundamental impact on an organization. So first, yes, you need buy-in from the executive, and you also need buy-in from the board. I think once you have that and you have a clear direction, then the first thing that needs to be done is to assemble all of the company's data in one place.
Before we move off of this organizational piece, talk a little bit about just the culture, one within the management team and the leadership team, and then also what kind of culture do you need to have with the people that are doing the work that allows them to try and find different tools, use different tools, and kind of get rid of this fear of failure or loss of control. So how do you build that culture both at the top of the company and down through the company?
Easy. Thanks for the easy questions today, Vonnie. um, so look, I think the first thing is there needs to be shared goals and shared alignment. And so this transcends tech, and this really goes to organizational culture. So there needs to be those shared goals and tone from the top. Two other aspects I would point to. The first is, and I think the first I'll talk about is one of the things that makes the IFPA great and the legacy organizations that came before us, is that we have this culture of perfection. Everything needs to be done, you know, superbly. And I think for anyone that's visited the expo or been to any of the shows that we host, you would see that in spades. With tech, perfection is often the enemy of progress. And so whether it's perfectionism or over engineering, waiting for clean data, waiting for the perfect system, waiting for the perfect answer from a system you've put in place, doesn't work. You need to make incremental progress and basically build from there. So have, minimum viable product and roll that out, and then continue to iterate and make progress. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say from a cultural perspective is that real value is created organizationally by bringing together very diverse or disparate skill sets, and then creating the environment for those individuals to be able to collaborate in a way that with very different individuals and very different skill sets. So for example, I like to give the example of, say, in financial services, say, trading, which is one of the biggest profit pools of investment banks and other firms. Now, it historically you had these very A-type traders, if you like, that basically did all the work. What you now have are traders increasingly overseeing algorithms, and those algorithms are basically designed by engineers who are very different from traders. And so you need to be able to have a culture where very different people, different skill sets can work together to create something new. And so if you bring that back to fresh produce, as we were talking earlier, it is more difficult to train someone in fresh produce than to find someone that has the requisite, I'd say, data analysis or tech skills. How do you bring those skills together to create something that's truly differentiated? That's the cultural challenge, if you like. And again, I'll go back to the point, as it needs to really start at the top, and there needs to be a very clear alignment across the whole organization in order to affect real change. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And I think in the produce industry, so many times people want to hire someone who knows the industry. That's like, it's so important to know the industry. But I think we're getting to the point, especially in the sophistication of some of the tech and some of the tools, is that we really need people who are specialists in that, like you said, and then we can, train them. And it can go both directions. But hopefully, this
Yeah.
moves to a younger workforce that has had, exposure to both a little bit more, and it's a little easier, I think, to be pliable.
Yes, so it was last year. We had a board meeting, and we have a couple of very tech savvy board members at the IFPA, and one of them made the point is that you basically need what was termed a translator, if you like. So it's someone that has the requisite domain expertise in fresh produce or an organization, and that has enough knowledge of technology, AI, whatever you want to call it, to direct a project, if you like, or at least know what's possible. So that translator function is very important. Doesn't mean that person necessarily needs to be a data scientist or a programmer, but it's someone that can work as a bridge, if you like, and that is really important. And if you alluded to the journey that we're on at the IFPA, I've been really pleasantly surprised by how enthusiastic the teams have been to try and come up the learning curve enough to be able to direct a project and to direct change. I think sometimes, though, intention, particularly with something new, is for someone to say, well, I want to go really, really deep and learn as much as I can. There is diminishing returns in that respect. You need enough knowledge to be able to direct a specialist, but not do everything yourself, if you like. So that then leads to your other question, which we can unpick around who owns it, who owns something like that internally, and that's where it gets a little bit more challenging.
I think something around the tools, though, that's interesting is that and we've had this conversation about build versus buy. Like how much do you want to build internally, and what can you buy off the shelf? But then I think the third option is just ask the tool to build to build what you need. Like you can just have the tool build itself. You can have the tool code, you can have the tool tell you what you need. And so it's this weird third option where is it build or buy or just use the tool. So how do you look at that, at kind of who owns it and who does the projects, because you don't need to be a coder or a programmer to do this stuff.
No, it absolutely. I mean, the tools are almost create themselves at the moment. I mean, you can have any number of foundational models, LLMs, create executable code these days. Now, of course, and you need to debug that code, and you also need to knit the code together. There are so many different tools out there. I think what we focus on and what I focus on at the moment is how you integrate different stacks,
Hmm.
because they're different tools that have different use cases. So we were talking earlier, for example, about, let's look at large language models. Okay, what large language models are extremely useful at digesting and making sense of unstructured data, text, PDFs, even audio, for example. Really good at that. What large language models historically haven't been good at, and still aren't great at, is ingesting structured data. Unless and there are some workarounds there, of course, but users get quite frustrated because they upload a 2-3 megabyte Excel file, and they expect a large language model to be able to extrapolate or inference, extrapolate insights from it, and it's very, very difficult. But you can certainly upload 1,000-page document, and it will do great at summarizing that document. So the part of the, I think, solution set going forward is knitting together different tools together in a stack, and then being able to swap those tools in and out as the tools develop, which they're developing extremely quickly. So I'll just end by saying, so if you look at certain tools like RAG, for example, retrieval augmented generation. I mean, 2 years ago, that took quite a bit of coding ability to be able to, take the data, cleanse it, and chunk it down, embed it in a vector database. You've got off-the-shelf tools at the moment, which you could do a simple RAG structure in 10 minutes and start adding huge amounts of value, basically for free. And that underscores the point of how quickly these tools are moving. And so, therefore, the need to move really quickly as you look at building a solution set in this space. And it sounds really scary, to be honest. The acronym sounds scary, the solution sounds scary, but it really fundamentally goes back to just building some familiarity around them, and then you know making sure that you've got the right data and the right tools for the solution that you want to implement. And I'm trying not to get too technical at the moment because it can turn people off. So that's but I think you know where I'm going with that.
Let's shift and take a few minutes to talk about some of the applications and some of the uses of this data to give people to in this conversation with here's some concrete things that I can think about.
Yeah, I mean the use cases are so many and varied, but let me give you one pertinent example. Let's talk about understanding, say, a market and market dynamics, which in this day and age, with the amount of volatility that we have, is fundamentally important because we are seeing the global trade environment change very rapidly. And given that we deal with hyper perishable products, our companies, our members generally have to pivot quite quickly when tariff or non-tariff barriers are imposed at a moment's notice. And so understanding markets, understanding how trade works is fundamentally important. So what is one use case? Well, there have been tools that are reasonably reliable that help us understand markets. So for example, you have the United Nations or the OECD or other organizations that publishes trade data. You have the US, from a US perspective, the USDA and other national bodies, be it government or industry associations, that publish reports. You have the FAO in the United Nations, again, that has a lot of very good data, albeit at an aggregate level, around the entire value chain. So you have all of that. And however, that data is very high level. It's often not clean. So, for example, a really good example of that is if you look at trade data, I think one of the largest exporters of fruit to China is Hong Kong. Now, I'm from Hong Kong. I've lived there for 30 years. I can tell you Hong Kong doesn't produce a lot of fruit, but it's part of the issue is that that's the way the data is presented in the database, and analysts, just sort of take that as a given, if you like. So what can you do there? Well, you can supplement all that information using a large language model with a lot of other tools. So, for example, from a production standpoint, you can use open source intelligence from, for example, satellite imagery to look at plantings. And you can correlate that with planting data and to build a fundamental view of how the production environment, particularly for fruits rather than vegetables, because the production cycles are longer. That's one of the things you can do, and that's at the very beginning of the value chain. The very end of the value chain, you can correlate things like weather. You can actually have real time access to what's on the water and actually get in front of what's going to land in a particular market. And if you're skillful enough, you can actually then correlate that and look into individual, and this is the scary bit, individual bills of ladings, either from particular companies or across a sector or in a particular market. So I'm I'm painting a very broad picture here and I'm bringing together a lot of threads, but I'll go back to the comment I made earlier. It's really only limited by innovation and creativity. And what you do with that data, the data that's available, and what you do with that data is, really up to the individual or the organization. So that lends itself very readily to doing anything from, a market study where a large language model can, spit out a few thousand page report very readily. One of the things that we're working on at the IFPA and that I'm working on at Freshalytics is how you make those tools available to producers and farmers that may not be as conversant or as tech savvy as a data scientist. And so the ability to, for example, have a conversation like we're having now with a model, to be able to tease things out on a real time basis, and then to say, okay, this has been a great conversation. I want you to give me a summary of the conversation. I want you to give me the bullet points, and I want you to give me the so what of for my organization. These are the things in the next 6 to 12 months, particularly from the IFPA, that you're going to see that I think is really going to blow the mind of the industry in a very good way. So I know, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but it is a very hard question to answer succinctly, at
No,
least for me. Yeah,
that's why we get to talk for more than 5 minutes. So
fair enough.
as we wrap up, what as if someone in the produce industry is listening to this, and they're just sitting there paralyzed because there's too many opportunities and too much data and it's craziness. Like what's the one thing you would say to them to just get started in thinking about using AI in their organization?
Hmm. The first thing is just understand what data you have. Get it in one place. Make sure you've got the appropriate controls on the data. So you have everything from public data. So, for example, an annual report from a listed company that's published, all the way through to, say, very sensitive HR data for your employees, and you treat them very differently. There are gradations in between. So, get your data in one place, tag it appropriately. Second is collect everything, and I mean everything. Data storage is very cheap. And the one thing that we've learned at Vertical Oceans, and the one thing I've learned at Freshalytics, is that data that you think is inconsequential today is very consequential later on down the track. It's valuable. So collect everything. Then armed with that is experiment. And when you experiment, if you're dealing with non-sensitive public data or external data, you can't break a model, and it's really risk free. And so it's experiment. In order to do that, you need to have internal champions in order to do that. And so that goes back to the conversation that we were having before. But then you also need to, I think, and here's one of the key things, is that we are at an inflection point at the moment, an important inflection point. Any company is not embedding AI into their business and automating what can be automated. There is an increased risk, I would say, over the next 3 to 5 years of that company being disrupted, disintermediated, or otherwise. And so we're at that inflection point at the moment, and so that really then is, I think, from a CEO, from a board or a CEO's perspective, some of the tough, challenging, but also very illuminating discussions that need to be happening in terms of how these tools are going to be embedded in the organization. So, I would go back to one of the comments I made earlier on in the call, which is don't think narrowly around, well, how is this going to help me grow or sell a head of lettuce or a head of broccoli or a box of avocados. It really needs much more enlightened thought and much more, time and dedicated effort.
Excellent. Well, Patrick, I think that's a good place to stop. And if that doesn't put the fear in people to get moving, I know what
Well, there are two things that drive people. One is fear, and the other is greed, if you
yeah,
like. That's the axiom from financial markets. So there is more upside than downside,
yeah,
and so I know the point that you were getting at, and it can be frightening, but when used appropriately, these tools can unleash productivity, effectiveness gains they're incredibly evolutionary. The companies that and individuals that embrace them will you see dividends very, very quickly. So that's the positive from all of this as well, I guess.
excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. It's great to talk to you. And thanks for all the work you're doing with my organization that makes it a great place for me to work. So thanks for that.
Pleasure's all mine. It's my privilege and my pleasure. Thank you. Good to talk today, Vonnie.
Thanks for tuning in to Fresh Takes on Tech, hosted by Vonnie Estes. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe, rate, and share it with your network. You can find more episodes and resources at freshproduce.com. See you next time for another Fresh Take.